My name is Therese Sjömander Magnusson. I'm the director of the Nordic Africa Institute. It is truly our pleasure to convene this timely conversation on accelerating adaptation to climate change, reduce induced risks. So both recovery and rebuilding are resource dependent. The need to accelerate local level adaptation actions are key as we move forward. However, we all know that a lot needs to be achieved in this regard, especially around accessibility to adaptation finance at local level, which supports a locally driven decision-making mechanism. I look forward to follow the discussions on these and associated topics here today, where the ambition is to share insights, perspectives, and inspire mutual learning. With that, I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Shilpa Ashokan, who will be moderating the session. Thank you, and over to you, Shilpa.
Thanks, Therese, for your welcome note. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who are tuning in. I'm Shilpa Ashokan, Senior Researcher at the Nordic Africa Institute, and I'll be moderating the webinar session today. Climate change impacts are very critical in vulnerable societies in Africa, mainly because a climate crisis within no time translates into a humanitarian crisis through acute food shortage and lack of access to safe and clean water. So this webinar aims to discuss climate change adaptation under increasing climate risks in Kenya and region East Africa. The focus of today's webinar is to conduct discussion on three main aspects of climate change adaptation. That is, on the need to break the cycle of recurrent climate risks, on how to address an immediate climate change-induced humanitarian crisis, and at the same time plan for a long-term climate change resilience building. And this will then be followed by a discussion centered on national policies and locally led decision-making and the need for climate adaptation finance at local level. So to begin with, we'll have an introduction session by the panelists, which will then be followed by a discussion session, and we'll take questions towards the end of the discussion session. We have an excellent panel today here with us, 4 panelists. Let me first invite Ulrika Åkesson. Ulrika is the lead policy specialist, environment and climate change at SIDA. Ulrika has 25 years of experience in development cooperation within the areas of environment and climate change from Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. Ulrika, please, I invite you for giving a short introduction.
Thank you very much, Shilpa. It's really an honor to be here today, and I very much look forward to our discussion to come. But just to say where SIDA is in this, climate change adaptation is at the heart of the Swedish development agenda. And we have a very clear road ahead through our environment and climate change policy and action plan in our work. In our policy, it is clearly spelled out that SIDA commits to protect the environment and to proactively promote a transformation to an environmentally sustainable development by integrating environment and climate change in all operations and sectors. SIDA's climate finance in 2019 was 4.65 billion Swedish kronor, which is about 18% of SIDA's total budget, and about 50% of that went to climate change adaptation programs and projects. And climate change adaptation is also at the heart of our climate support in Africa. 15 out of 17 bilateral and regional strategies have environment and climate change as a goal as part of their Swedish strategies. And we work with long-term and humanitarian support and the intersection of the two. And as you all know, Africa is dependent on its natural resources, and 70% of the rural population relies on those for their livelihoods. And the majority of agriculture is rain-fed, making many very vulnerable to climate change. And with extreme weather events, the vulnerable population is mostly affected, and often in combination with food security and other challenges for their livelihoods. And now this is even more challenging in combination with the COVID crisis and high unemployment rates following that, and making things even worse. And we do support climate change adaptation regionally and bilaterally through disaster risk reduction and early warning systems. We do it through resilience programs, climate data collection, climate justice, and climate change in budgetary processes, but also with a very strong focus in many programs of support at the local level. And I think it's also important to think about dealing with multidimensional risks such as fragile states, conflict, climate, and food insecurity at the same time in the context we're talking about. And as an example, when we now look at a new regional strategy for our work in Africa, we can see what has worked very well as capacity to generate weather and climate information, and it has improved as well as connecting resilience, disaster risk reduction, and conflict. But we also have challenges such as that the context is changing with rising intensity of weather-related challenges. And we also see that sub-regions affected by climate change and conflicts should work closer with peace clusters, and that there is a limited climate funding reaching fragile contexts. All this needs to be considered in the pathway ahead. And finally, I would just like to say that at the regional level and among our partners, we find the discussion on bringing Africa's voice and African positions forward at COP26 of utmost importance, when climate change adaptation needs to be given the attention it requires and deserves. So thanks, over to you.
Thanks very much, Ulrika. Next, let me invite Victor Orindi. Victor is representing Adaptation Consortium, Kenya. Victor works on the linkage between climate change and development in developing countries, and has worked in the design and piloting of the County Climate Change Fund mechanism that aims at supporting county governments access climate finance and mainstream climate change into planning and implementation. Victor, please, I invite you for giving a short introduction.
Yeah, thanks, Shilpa. My name is Victor Orindi, as he said, with the Adaptation Consortium based here in Kenya. The consortium brings together both government and NGOs working together to support largely subnational governments. In our case, this is the county governments. We have 47 of them, and we've largely been focusing on supporting them to see how best we can mainstream climate change in planning and implementation, considering that large parts of the country are affected in one way or the other. Secondly, the work we've been doing, as the facilitator has said, is to follow up after you plan. How do you ensure that some of these plans are implemented to help people cope or adapt to the challenges being experienced? And therefore, the work has also focused in areas of enabling or supporting the counties to tap into resources available, either nationally or internationally. That's the climate finance, in order to support implementation of their priority interventions. The idea is really to ensure that we promote inclusive climate resilient development that puts the vulnerable groups at the center of decision making as far as how resources are used and where they are used. The work has been largely done in a way that it aligns with our policies and relevant legislation. So the beauty of that is that it enhances institutionalization of the process going forward. Thank you for now.
Thanks very much, Victor. And I now invite Anil Mishra. Anil is the Chief of Section, Hydrological Systems and Water Scarcity at UNESCO. Anil has over 20 years of experience in the field of hydrology and water resources and adaptation policies in Africa, Asia, Latin America and Caribbean, Arab regions, and Europe. Anil, please, I invite you for giving a short introduction.
Thank you, Shilpa. Thank you for having me here and giving me opportunity to say a few words. And this session, the title is very important: climate change adaptation. I come from UNESCO. UNESCO stands for United Nations Education, Scientific and Cultural Organization. So harnessing science, providing solution in the context of culture and education is really mandate of our organization. In the context of climate change, water is considered as the victim of the climate change because it suffers most and it across all the agendas. But it also provides solution to all the international goals and commitments. That's why it is considered as a connector. And coming from intergovernmental hydrological program, as a hydrologist, I see in the context of climate change adaptation, there are three issues that I will be highlighting in the discussion part. The first is to understand climate change impact at the local level. We are all coming up with the downscale scenario, but we don't really know what is happening at the local level. That's why local involvement in defining climate change impact is very important. In other words, the local participation in validating climate scenarios are very important. And then also coming up with the citizen science approach that local stakeholder defining solution is very important. UNESCO also puts lots of emphasis on indigenous knowledge. In order to solve the problem, local problem, we need to gather local knowledge and also validate scientific findings by local stakeholders. So that's what I'm going to be highlighting in my discussion point. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Anil. And let me now invite Mohammed Omar Mukher Abujan. Mohammed is the Regional Director, Africa, for the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. Mohammed has 30 years of experience in humanitarian operations management, development work, and has led programs on disaster risk reduction, community resilience, climate change management, food security, among others. Mohammed, please, I invite you for giving a short introduction.
Thank you very much, Shilpa. And it is a pleasure of the IFRC, International Federation of Red Cross, to join this platform. For us to handle the humanitarian consequences of the changing climate, our climate change strategy has three pillars. Pillar number one, readiness and community preparedness. Because we are a community-based organizations, we believe in the community-driven solutions in terms of preparedness, strengthening resilience, contingency planning, and readiness. And we do that to minimize the loss and damages of the climate changes, basically too much water, floods, but also in terms of drought. So this is pillar number one, readiness and preparedness to handle the extreme events. Pillar number two, we try to support the international, regional and national efforts into the climate mitigation efforts. And we do that through the small, simple actions. For us, for example, in Africa, we have a huge Pan-African initiative, so planting and caring for trees. We try, through planting and caring for trees, get involved into the environmental awareness, environmental education, and spreading the climate risk, especially in schools, and to make sure that the children and community increase the culture of awareness and the culture of environmental protection. Pillar number three, on the advocacy and policy. We are auxiliary to the government. Red Cross, Red Crescent exists in 192 countries. In all of these countries, we have a specific mandate from the government, but also the IFRC is actually an observer into the COP negotiations. So we are part of the Conference of the Parties of the Climate Change. We advise governments. We have the floor to speak with the high-level policymakers in governmental, United Nations, etc. And we attend these platforms to bring out the voice of the most vulnerable. What does it mean on the ground? We collect body of evidence and facts and figures as a Red Cross, Red Crescent, how does the changing climate affect the livelihood and affect the environment. And we bring that to the negotiations in a positive way to help all the parties and to help the government to take the proper and correct actions. So thank you very much, Shilpa, and I look forward for the conversation.
Thanks very much, Mohammed. Thanks, everyone. Now let us quickly move to the discussion segment. Let me open the first discussion point. Looking at the situation in Kenya and region East Africa in general, where the return period of severe droughts and floods are becoming increasingly shorter, meaning it escalates climate risks, thereby affecting food and water security. The concern here is that the time available for recovery and rebuilding for the vulnerable communities are becoming increasingly less. And within this context, we would like to know what your thoughts are on how to break the cycle of these recurrent climate risks. Let me start with Victor. In Kenya, does the situation end up being a constant firefighting after the occurrence of these severe floods and droughts? What are the systems currently in place towards breaking these recurrent climate risks? Victor, you can go now.
Thanks, Shilpa. I think we've had a long journey in terms of dealing with the recurrent drought and even flooding events in Kenya. And I think we are at a point where we can say that we are making some good progress going forward. If you look at the national level, I think we do appreciate the fact that a dedicated agency was created, for example, to deal with the drought on a more permanent basis and not firefighting when droughts do occur. And of course, strategic plans have been developed that look at dealing with it from a point of investing upfront, that is preparing the ground so that even though droughts may occur, then it doesn't really result into emergencies. So I think where we are, we can say that we are moving forward, but there's still more to be done. In terms of specific things that have been done that I can talk about from where I sit, one is that through such institutions, we've had good investments in early warning systems, which we think is the starting point in terms of proactively dealing with this challenge. With good early warning systems, followed by timely and quick response, I think we do ensure that they don't escalate to emergencies. Additionally, there's been a targeted investment in what we are calling the foundations for development, things like human capital, infrastructure, etc., things that can enable people to have options, be more resilient even in terms of when these events do occur, people have options to fall into. And therefore, we are saying that with this kind of processes, which also brings on board both development partners and just working together to support early warning, to support the responses at different levels. Of course, also the subnational level, if you look at them, they are also dedicating resources to be able to deal with some of these challenges. We are seeing a situation where we are moving towards the side of resilience, but still we have a lot to do, more so by the virtue of the fact that the frequency and also the intensity are increasing, and therefore we need to pull a bit, building on what we've experienced and what we've instituted.
Thanks, Victor. Thanks. Several points mentioned there, including risk transfer and management strategies, resource mobilization, and also perhaps the national climate change strategy and the action plan, and also the focus on multi-stakeholder participation. Let me now move to Anil. Anil, if you could take us through your perspective on how science-informed decision-making can help this situation.
In fact, when we are addressing climate change impact, particularly Shilpa, when you highlighted reoccurrence of flood and drought, I would say the uncertainty of these return period, 100-year flood may have a second year every third year, or 50-year drought may have only after 5 years. That's one point. The second point is water availability in Kenya now, approximately 650 meter cube per year may drop more than 50%, not only because climate change, but also because of population growth. So science needs to really define what is the climate impact, but also what are other drivers. When we are able to define the drivers that will have impact on water availability, and at the same time, now there is a technology to really track seasonal, sub-seasonal forecast of the weather system, in other words, midsummer drought or sub-seasonal system. So these scientific technologies, but also at the same time, the technology is advancing with the low-cost sensors. So if we can motivate citizens to gather data, there are very few data available to predict exactly water availability at the local level. But because of advancements in the technology, and in the internet, there is a 3D printer, weather stations are available. So if we can engage citizens in validating and calibrating data, perhaps we can narrow the margin of the risk factor by predicting floods and drought more accurately, and perhaps that can provide solution to the local level. So it's very important to understand whether we have considered engagement of citizens in collecting and validating data sets in order to define the drivers besides climate. And that's how science role and education role is very important.
Thanks, Anil. Thanks for all those information on the importance of citizen science and scientific tools, methodologies, and interventions. Let me now move to Ulrika. We very much look forward to hear from you from a donor point of view, from a developmental agency, how SIDA is complementing through support in this region.
Thank you, Shilpa. I'll try to move into this important question. So it is a challenging and big question, and we try to deal with it through our support, through our strategies bilaterally and regionally in Africa in various ways. In the Horn of Africa, we have seen an increase in intensity of the droughts and floods during the last decade, eroding the asset base of poor pastoral and agro-pastoral communities and leading to worsening conditions of disaster risk. And climate risks such as floods and droughts are also compounded with other risks such as protracted conflicts, locust, and now also COVID-19, resulting in increasing vulnerability and needs. And consequently, chronic food insecurity also is very prevalent in the region. And if I give you an example from the humanitarian perspective, we work together with our humanitarian colleagues to break the cycle of these recurrent risks to ensure that the risk does not lead to a crisis. And there is a need to support efforts that help the most vulnerable at risk to prevent, to mitigate and deal with, and also recover from recurrent crises and being able to develop despite these recurrent shocks. And complementing humanitarian efforts, our long-term development cooperation, both at regional but also at bilateral level, we do support resilience building efforts as well as efforts dealing with the underlying causes of the crisis. And for example, in the areas of coordination, livelihoods, in early warning and social safety nets, but also resilient smallholder farming systems, water access and management, and climate smart agriculture. And there is not one single answer on how to break the cycle of these recurrent climate risks, but these were just some examples on how we try to tackle the challenges.
Thanks, Ulrika. Thanks for giving those concrete examples on how SIDA is supporting the region, both as a regional and also bilateral support in decreasing these climate risks. Mohammed, if you could take us through the regional perspective at IFRC in addressing these recurrent climate risks.
Thank you very much. Just to confirm what colleagues has been saying, for us in the IFRC from the ground, we see the increase in intensity and frequency of these extreme events, especially drought and floods. If you take the current flooding situation, 2020, last year, in 1 month, we handled 12 flood operations. And that has been fundamentally in East Africa, Horn of Africa, but also in the Sahel and in SADC region. So it's huge. This year we are expecting and monitoring maybe about 20 countries that is going to be affected directly by flooding. And currently, over the last 2 weeks, we are running 4 flood operations in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, and all of them we are using our own Red Cross, Red Crescent disaster response funding to respond. Similarly for the drought, we estimate 100 million people in Africa affected directly by compounded effects of issues, drought, locust, COVID, and other epidemics. And those people, they need food assistance, but they need also livelihood assistance. And what we are doing as a Red Cross, Red Crescent, we are intensifying our effort to invest on community resilience. We are spending most of the time with our Red Cross, Red Crescent National Society across Africa and including in Kenya. For example, in Kenya, there is 1.4 million people in the arid land that need food and livelihood assistance. And we're currently working with the Kenya Red Cross to handle that and to make sure that these people don't get into a crisis and those people don't get to push to move out and to get into displacement. So that's a huge, and we're looking for support. We have the plans in place together with the Kenya Red Cross, and we are doing our best through the early warning, early action to get to them and to provide them that services. Similarly, for the case of flooding, if you take in Kenya, in 2020, there is 100,000 people being displaced because of the floods. But this year, part of our contingency plan, a readiness plan, we are currently responding almost in the same locations with the same people in the same communities. But this time we try, I hope our actions are early enough to stop displacement. For us, broadly speaking in Africa, we think the real solution to get down and to reduce the humanitarian consequences and impact of climate changing and to strengthen the adaptation measures is to invest more on localization. What I mean by localization, I mean the whole spectrum of early warning, early actions. Yes, prediction improved. Yes, scientific information improved. Yes, projection and modeling improved. But most of this information, most of the time, doesn't get down to the communities. If it gets down to the communities, what does it mean for them? It has not been simplified. It has not been unpacked in practical way to tell to the nomadic, what does it mean for you, for your animals? What does it mean for the small farmers? What does it mean for the poor family living in the shanty town in Kibera? So I think this is the real challenges. The real challenges for us in Red Cross, Red Crescent, we should try to address with the governments and the other key partners is to make sure that we are strengthening and spending time on localization. We are spending time on early warning, early actions, making sure that information get to people on time. We intensify the public awareness and education. We help people with accurate messaging to take actions, and we give them that support, both in terms of the readiness and in terms of building the resilience. I think it is possible, and we have seen so many good examples, and we have evidence across the Africa region that with a little investment, but has to be systematic, has to be consistent, and it has to be for long term.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Mohammed. Lots of important points, takeaways on understanding the long-term root causes and risk-informed action at local level. Thank you, panel, for addressing the issue from several different angles. Just a reminder to the audience, please go ahead and type your questions in the Q&A box. I have seen that there are some questions and few are answered. We will take the questions towards the end, that is after the panel discussion session. And with that, let me move to the next part of the discussion and open the discussion point. Addressing an immediate climate change-induced humanitarian crisis and planning for a long-term climate change resilience building. Does the increasing demand of addressing the immediate climate change-induced humanitarian crisis put pressure on the country's long-term climate change resilience building, planning, and resource allocation? Because both are important. Are there coordinated efforts among relevant actors in this regard? Are there any trade-offs currently? Let me start with Anil. Anil, in the context of fulfilling developmental aspirations of a country, how well are the adaptation needs emphasized?
It is very important question. The development aspirations of the countries must be fulfilled, and particularly developing countries are the victim of the climate change, of the emissions that they have not produced globally. And now we are trying to find solution at the local level. And as I said, in the global context, particularly developing countries are the victim. So what are the important strategies that needs to be addressed? But also, at the same time, the countries are facing unprecedented challenges beyond climate drivers. As I said again, in Kenya alone, the water availability is going to be decreased, of course, because of climate variability, climate change, but also because of population growth. So those are complex issues that needs to be addressed. But we have now technologies available and low-cost technologies moreover. But the most important point is to emphasize on education, to be able to operate those low-cost tools and methodologies. As I mentioned in earlier slot, the low-cost sensors, 3D printers, which can be operated at the local level in order to validate. Sometimes we just borrow these climate scenarios and we never know what is the local level of projection. We have never tested it. We have just borrowed these projections based on global circulation model without really testing and validating. But there is a availability, Internet of Things, low-cost sensors, which can provide the data at the real-time level, the weather stations, so we can validate. And also in the engagement with the local stakeholders and local knowledge, we will be able to identify problems with or without climate change. What are the issues? I'm talking about water, particularly being a hydrologist. So we definitely need to look in the long run, and development aspiration has to be fulfilled, including commitment not only by the countries, but also there are commitments that needs to be shared. So I would like to refer to SDG 17, the partnership aspect, where international agencies and international community needs to take their responsibility as well, and particularly in the context of Africa, to build human capacity so that the local level solution can be found with the local technologies available. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anil, on stressing on the local level solutions and at the same time the international commitments. Let me move to Mohammed. Mohammed, if you could take us through the situation on the ground, where there is increased flooding and droughts, meaning increased humanitarian crisis. How well is this shock absorbed within the country's long-term climate change resilience building plans?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Shilpa. Let me maybe go a step back and to make one comment about the integrated efforts, the integrated international efforts to handle the issues of changing climate. And I think in terms of policy convergence, the globe is very good. I think the whole governments plus the civil society and the United Nations and international organizations like us share 4 policy commitments to handle the multiple risks facing the globe, including the changing climate. And this commitment is fundamentally to ensure the global peace and security and sustainability. So we got the Sustainable Development Goals, we got the Paris Agreement to handle specifically the adaptation and mitigation issues. We got number 3, the World Humanitarian Summit and the Grand Bargains, and that is basically to push and to support the agenda for localization. And we got the Sendai Framework for Action for DRR. So this big policy architect, these 4 interrelated policy commitments are very crucial and fundamental. And I think if we only took 50% of these commitments down to national and subnational level, that will significantly address the issues we are talking about in terms of the extreme events and addressing the root causes of vulnerability and risk, and strengthening the resilience at the subnational level, especially at the high-risk areas and the most vulnerable groups, whether they are nomadic, women, migrants, or displaced people. I think the weaker point of us working together is not at the policy architect, it is at the planning and actions. I wouldn't make any strong statement that any of the African countries, 49 African countries we are covering, that we have this integrated work in terms of planning and interventions. I wouldn't also make any statement that is of overlap and parallel efforts being taken by these different initiatives. To me, from where I sit as a Red Cross Red Crescent, in our approach and strategies, we're trying our best to align and to integrate the humanitarian agenda with the climate change, with the SDGs, and to make sure that if we have any actions, it has to be very well informed and guided by the principles of these policies. It also, we are trying our best to advise, because we have a convening power with our own governments as the Red Cross Red Crescent, to advise them the best to pay attention to the high-risk areas where we have the tension, places where we have the violence and conflict, places where we have the arid lands, and places where we have communities that are a little bit left behind. So in short, I would say that the policy architect is excellent and is very good, and I think it fit for purpose. But I think when we come to the planning and interventions, we have a lot to do, governments, international community, and civil society, to improve the planning and interventions, and to make sure that we are also fit for purpose, and we are listening to people, and we are responding to needs of people. Currently, unfortunately and sadly, I cannot say that in Africa. Thank you.
Thanks, Mohammed, on highlighting the need of policy to be influenced by intervention. Now let me move to Victor. Victor, are the long-term climate change planning taking into account the occurrence of short-term unplanned climate-related crises in Kenya?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, that's happening. If you look at our guiding philosophy now, I think the country is talking about low carbon climate resilient development. And that means that all sectors, all actors need to focus on how we support resilience building in the longer term. However, I think it's also recognized that there will be these immediate needs that have to be dealt with. If, for example, there's conflict, if, for example, there is invasion by locusts, these are immediate problems that have to be addressed there and then. And I think the question or the issue has been that do we have good contingency plans backed up by resources that can respond to such needs fairly quickly? And that goes to the issue of, if I can use the issue of locusts that came, invaded Kenya this year and part of the Horn of Africa. I think it was something that was, of course, forecasted, but something we've never experienced for decades now. But the fact that it was hitting us at the core, that's at the core, food security, meant that we have to deal with it, even if you're thinking about implementing your long-term plans. And therefore, you could see that resources were mobilized, institutions got together, of course, under the leadership of government and other agencies, and effectively dealt with the issue in terms of bringing the numbers of the locusts down, and therefore people are able to at least continue some of the activities. I think the key thing would be, as we work towards supporting or enabling our communities to be more resilient, we need also, as part of the equation, look at what are the underlying drivers of some of these emergent crises that we often face. If you're talking about conflicts, like other panelists have said, what are the underlying causes and how do we deal with them in the longer term, even as we firefight for the time being? One of the issues, especially for conflicts, especially as far as natural resources are concerned, is about intense competition, especially where the rules of engagement are not effectively enforced or they're broken down. And therefore, if we start addressing that, even as we do our long-term interventions, I think we'll come at a situation where we at least close the gap and therefore have less people being or in a situation where we require them, we'll need this kind of short-term emergency response, which is actually our vision. The fact that programs have been put in place also is good. We have good case studies. I think one to borrow from the NDMA, the National Drought Management Authority. You look at the program they are implementing on hunger safety net, which was targeting the most food insecure household in the very dry areas. And this is targeted, so it means you are dealing with the people at the very margins that need support. But it's expected that with time, because the way the support is channeled is through cash and through can I say, electronic system. So it's not fooded anymore, but providing people with support. The expectation is that with the time, some of these people can accumulate some resources and be able to graduate out of that situation. So I think that's a good case study for me, that or a good model that we can borrow as a way of bridging the gap between dealing with immediate needs and also building resilience. Because if we continue supporting those in very dire need, and we do that to an extent that they reach a threshold where they can graduate and be able to support themselves, then I think we can start contributing to the longer term. There's no way we can close our eyes to the very urgent needs. You asked about trade-off. I think it's a tricky situation when you talk about humanitarian long term. I think they complement each other, but I would see that the only trade-off we can talk about, maybe theoretically, is that you are reallocating resources that you are planned to do some interventions or some development activity to respond to these emergent needs. But as I say, there are needs that have to be dealt with in order to move forward.
Thanks,
Thank
Victor.
you.
Yeah, thanks a lot for taking us through the strategy that the government is undertaking to graduate as many vulnerable population from the immediate support category. Let me now go to Ulrika. Ulrika, if you could take us through some of SIDA's support in climate change resilience building in the region.
Yeah, I'll try to do so. And I think there are several coordinated efforts to address long-term resilience of vulnerable communities towards climate shocks, both at the regional and country level. And there is a need to work at all levels, local and national and regional, and also connect analytical tools as well as policy and financing instruments for long-term adaptation with short-term forecasts based on action on post-disaster response. And as an example, we regionally, we support IGAD's Drought Disaster Resilience and Sustainability Initiative that brings together governments and partners in Djibouti, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, and South Sudan and Uganda to contribute to enhancing resilience to environmental impact and climate change and natural resources, and also promote the sustainable use of natural resources. And another example is a rural resilience initiative through WFP and Oxfam to enable vulnerable rural families to increase their food and income security by managing climate-related risks. And through this innovative and integrated climate risk management approach, I think the program enables the poorest farmers in various African countries to access crop insurance by participating in risk reduction activities. And assets built through such activities promote the resilience of farmers and their families by steadily decreasing vulnerability to disaster risks over time. And there are many more interesting initiatives that we support that I unfortunately don't have the time to mention now, but these were a few examples.
Thanks very much, Ulrika, for highlighting at least some of the projects through which CERA is focusing on resilience building with the aim of better preparing the communities when a crisis strikes. To conclude this session, so with the increasing climate risks in the region and with the pace of adaptation and humanitarian actions happening, we see that these have to sort of happen hand in hand, and the need to work together so that the region can move from a reactive response to a more proactive planning. And just a reminder to the audience again, please go ahead with the questions in the Q&A box, which I see that you are already typing and some of them are already answered. So panelists, I encourage you to please look through the questions when you get the time so that we can cover as many questions. So there are only few to answer towards the end of the session. Now, let me move to the last part of the discussion and open the discussion point. Countries have national climate policies, NDCs, but when it comes to its implementation, especially at local levels, there are several challenges. Capacity gaps, it's increasing. Climate change adaptation funding at local level is an issue. There is a lack of locally driven climate change adaptation mechanisms, monitoring sustainability issues. So the question being, are there any examples of locally led climate change adaptation mechanisms? What are the factors that are working positively? What are the challenges? Let me start with Mohammed. Mohammed, if you could take us through on how well are the local level adaptation implemented by looking at it from a regional perspective, the role of funding and what is currently lacking?
Thank you very much, Shilpa. For us, the Red Cross, Red Crescent been using our volunteers. We have 1.7 million active volunteers in Africa. And those are the volunteers who help us to take the adaptation actions from public awareness and education, from risk education in school, to helping communities to put contingency plans in place. For us, what we see it is quite actually economic efficient to invest on that level of adaptation at the community level, because with the effort of the community itself, what we provide as a Red Cross, Red Crescent, sometimes we only provide the knowledge, we provide the key messages, we provide the information, and we provide some materials that can help the community to deal with the type of risk that has been induced by the changing climate. For us, what we see on the ground from working at that community level adaptation measures. For example, planting trees. If you take Kenya Red Cross, as part of supporting the Kenya government national adaptation plan, they would like to embark, and in agreement actually with the Ministry of Environment and the Ministry of Education, they would like to get involved into at least planting 2 billion trees to increase the green space in Kenya by 17% as by the government national adaptation plans. And they would like to couple that with the recycling and education about the garbage collections, activities about environmental cleaning, risk education, climate risk education in schools. Now, this plan is quite awesome, it's quite good, and Kenya Red Cross volunteers and members are quite capable to deliver that in direct support to the national adaptation plans, but it's funding. I mean, for us, the key issue, national adaptation funding is not really hitting the ground. We don't see a lot of discussions in where we sit in the national forums and at the local actions that funding is actually been reaching that level. That is one key element. Second key element, as I've said at some point of my answer, how could we integrate the planning? How could we get the core benefits? The core benefits of DRR and resilience would be to support the adaptation agenda, and how could we get the core benefit from the SDGs investment? I think that planning and the integration of planning and actions is a little bit weaker at all levels. I mean, at the levels of local level and subnational level. And I think that one, an area we think it could be improved. For us in the Red Cross Red Crescent, we are trying our best. If we take last week, for example, we signed an agreement with World Vision International, and the main purpose of that to help us to improve the adaptations, because we cannot cope with the increasing demands and the extreme events and the damage and losses caused by the climate-related risks, whether it is drought, whether it is extreme floods.
Thanks very much, Mohammed. Just being watchful of the time here and quickly moving to Victor. Victor, if you could talk about the locally led climate change adaptation mechanisms that was piloted in Kenya, and take us through it. How efficient is the county climate change funding mechanism?
Yeah, thanks. I think, yeah, this is a mechanism, as I said, that essentially was designed to support our subnational governments, the counties, to access climate resources and use it to finance priority climate change interventions. And as I mentioned, the central idea is to have people who are affected at the center of decision making. So we have communities organized in committees and leading the process of identifying and working with the technocrats to prioritize and strengthen proposals that respond to their needs. What we've seen is that with the stronger use of climate information and with support of other institutions, research and technical institutions in government, we are seeing pertinent investments identified, investment responding to people's needs, and they are owned. The other beauty with it is that it's anchored in the county law, and therefore there are earmarked resources from the county budget. So we are not only looking outside, but also looking inward to support the intervention. That provides predictability and sustainability, because as you know, some of these challenges cannot be dealt with in 1, 2, 3 years. I think it's a long-term thing. So having some predictable financing, however little it is critical in ensuring sustainability. And of course, with that, I think we see it being taken forward across a number of countries as well. Thanks. I think in the interest of time, let me stop there.
Thanks, Victor. It was very informative, and to see the potential of something similar that can probably be replicated in the nearby East African countries. Now let me move to Ulrika. With what both Mohammed and Victor has mentioned, with that thought still in mind, Ulrika, if you could take us through how well are the mainstreaming of national policies to local level actions taking place here, and how easy is it to institutionalize similar locally driven funding mechanisms?
Well, thank you, Shilpa. I just to give an example from Kenya, we supported Kenya through the International Institute for Environment and Development, IID, with a focus of climate finance to reach the local level, both with capacity building and project support at the county level. And now we are currently preparing a new support following on this to financing local-led climate action. And the lessons learned from the pilot phase is now considered, and the development of a new program is designed based on these lessons. And in the current portfolio of support bilaterally in Kenya, there is a dominance of local level adaptation and resilience programs, to the extent actually that SIDA now looks at what complementary measures for enabling environment support there is to find support to areas such as, for example, WRM, or water resource management, that can't only be sold at a local and community level, but also on different levels. So I wanted to mention that. I think it's interesting. But also something I wanted to mention here is also something that I think is very worth looking at for other countries in the region, in Africa, is the report published in January this year in Kenya on the landscape of climate finance on the road to implementing Kenya's NDC, as a first actually attempt to track the climate finance flows in the country since the Paris Agreement. But I'll stop there. I had something more to say than that, but I'll leave it at that at this point.
Thanks a lot, Ulrika, for all those points. And quickly moving to Anil. Anil, if you could discuss it at a broader scale, that is international commitments, national priorities, and local actions. How effective is this progression currently?
Particularly in terms of water, it has been recognized both at the higher level and also at the national implementation level. However, at the local level, the capacity is still not really there to implement all these goals and commitment. I just want to give one statistics which was done in order to meet MDGs at that time, not SDGs. There was a necessary to increase water professional in Africa by more than 300 times. That was the statistics done by UNESCO IHE, Institute of Hydraulic Institute. Now, with the situation where we are talking about implementing SDGs by 2030, the capacity still needs to be addressed. And that's why I said, but again, I saw there are lots of questions in the chat. The involvement of the citizens in finding problem, in defining problem, in validating data, and coming up with solution, perhaps can address some of those issues, including using the knowledge of indigenous knowledge. There are several questions are asked in that point. I would like to inform there is a climate risk informed decision analysis methodology UNESCO launched. And if you Google CRIDA, perhaps I will also type CRIDA, UNESCO Climate Risk Informed Decision Analysis, or Climate Resilient Water Management Approaches, we have been bringing the local issues from all over the world, including from Africa. So if you just Google climate resilient water management approaches, in which we start with the shared vision planning workshop, really identifying needs of the problem and defining problem, whether there is a climate is a driver or non-climatic driver, and then using certain methodologies. I also take the opportunity to address some of the questions. Citizen science, which is just coming out from some of the case studies we collaborated in Ethiopia, and we are doing also in Latin America. It is not I don't think citizen science has not been used. It has been used, but not really in the context of validating scientific input. So there is a need to engage in a project funded by CEDA, for instance, or implemented by many other organizations. That needs to be considered. And of course, the local and indigenous knowledge is a very important. There was a study done in the pastoral community, the drought early warning system information from the hydrological modeling were compared with the local knowledge coming from pastoral community. So we really need to integrate those knowledge and information. So to conclude, in order to implement, there is a need and that the capacity needs to be enhanced, but with the involvement and engagement of the citizens. Thank you.
Thanks, Anil. And through that, you have answered several of the questions in the Q&A box also, I could see. And we are running short of time. So I'm quickly screening through the questions, and perhaps I can put few questions which is open for all the panelists here. One question from Moinia Koroma is on rural dwellers play a critical role in solving the issues of climate change. What are the long-term inclusive measures put in place to address climate concerns? If any of you could answer that.
Hello, Shilpa. I think for me, it's yes, we do agree that rural dwellers play a key role. And if you look at our case, where we implemented the County Climate Change Fund, it was largely in rural areas, which are also having high rates of poverty, among others. But I think the way we were working is that you leave no one behind. I think we were developing structures, platforms that brings everybody on board, communities and the government, and state actors, the development partners, to work together to a common cause. If we single out a particular group, then I think we could be doing a disservice, or we could end up creating other problems. Remember, the rural folks are also linked to the urban areas. One, in terms of movement of people in search of jobs. There's the supply of food from rural areas to urban areas. So there's the need to link markets, among other things. So for me, I think it's finding better ways of strengthening the participatory processes, having genuine conversations at every level to ensure that their voices are heard and they are enabled to participate in most of these processes.
Can I add to that, Shilpa? I think
Yes,
I mentioned a specific program that I think is really good from that perspective, that we support a rural resilience initiative. And I think this really enables vulnerable rural families to increase their food and income security, and by managing climate-related risks. And it also has a very innovative and integrated climate risk management approach, and enables the poorest farmers in various African countries to access crop insurance by participating in various risk reduction activities. So that's just one example. We have that part of a lot of support that we give.
Oh, thanks, Ulrika. And probably one more question, which is open to all. It's about the awareness, how to create awareness. It's a question from Lilian Namuma S. Kongani about, if I could read the last two lines, because it's a big question. Majority suggested that climate change was mainly caused by natural causes. This could have been for fear of victimization, but it suggests the need to increase awareness. So is there anything that need to be done when it comes to the climate awareness of the climate change aspect?
Yes, Shilpa, if I can maybe try. Thank you. For us in Red Cross, Red Crescent, we think one of the most efficient in our experience way to raise the awareness of climate risk risk in general is actually to work in the schools. We have been doing this quite good in Africa and many other continents, especially Latin America. And we believe the children are the best educator. The minute we get there and we put the principles of risk management in general, including environmental risk and climate risk, then that has been quite good for us to spread it in the communities through the children talking to their parents and friends and colleagues and communities. So that is one way we are dealing with quite well. But the other thing we are doing, all our 1.7 million volunteers in Africa, they're actually well acquainted with the broader risk in Africa, epidemic risk, climate risk, etc. And we engage in a lot of community awareness sessions, ranging from first aid to disaster risk to climate risk. So thank you.
Thanks, panelists. And we are about 7 minutes after our planned time. So I thank you all. We couldn't take all the questions, but most of them are covered and you have answered it via the Q&A box as well. To conclude, thanks for having such a rich and excellent discussion on focusing on climate change adaptation, on the importance of locally led decision making in climate change adaptation, and the need for climate change adaptation finance. And at the same time, how important is it to have this adaptation finance reach the local level and having or developing a mechanism or a system in place to work with the access and management of climate finance at local level, especially important as we are moving towards COP26. And also, furthermore, the need for mainstreaming national policies to local level actions, and at the same time institutionalizing the local level climate change adaptation actions to the national framework. So I thank all the panelists for the very interesting discussion, and also I thank the audience for your participation and excellent questions. We couldn't address all of them, but we tried to address majority of the questions. And with that, I wish you all a very nice rest of the day, rest of the evening. And with this, I announce that the webinar is now closed. Thank you.